So, I watched this latest Black Pigeon Speaks video. Multiculturalism has failed. I was pretty strongly motivated to respond to this one. The first thing he brought up in it was Melbourne, which is where I work and live. Specifically, I'm a West Melbourneite, which is, as we say, diverse as fuck. And I found his ideas on multiculturalism clashed pretty strongly with my own perception of life here. So I did some reading, and it's safe to say I was even more motivated to respond. So please, everyone, watch his video first. Make sure I'm not misrepresenting him. Check sources, always a good idea. Also, everyone gets things wrong. Chances are I will too, so any corrections or refutations are welcome. There's three main sections in his video, and the style changes a bit between them. As such, you'll notice my style changes in accordance. I've also been as pointed and as concise as I could be throughout, so hopefully this video is no longer than it absolutely needs to be. That said, it was a very info-heavy video, and I didn't really feel like I could effectively respond without addressing it as thoroughly as possible. As well, the introduction of ideas might have flowed well for the point Black Pigeon Speaks was trying to make, but less so for a response. There's a few spots where I need to let an issue hang to address later or refer back to previous points, etc. As such, I apologise then for any length issues or any annoyance you may feel. So here it is then. Multiculturalism has failed. Yeah, nah. The intro section. As I stated, the first thing mentioned is street gangs terrorising Melbourne. Now there's no source given, unless I missed it, but I'm assuming this is talking about the recent commentary on a supposed wave of African gangs making it so we in Melbs were all too afraid to leave our homes. So this whole brouhaha went through a few stages, with initial claims followed by a police commissioner denying the gangs existed before an acting chief commissioner stated that they did exist but weren't organised. Along the way, lots of politicians weighed in and still are to score their points. This report, though, I think summarises the important facts. There's some overrepresentation of African-born youth in crime in this state, but the numbers are small, and you're still way more likely to be attacked or victimised by a locally born person and those on a short list of other migrant groups that, for whatever reason, aren't the focus at the moment. For perspective, for the case of assaults by people born in Africa, we're talking about 54 assaults in 1 year. Now that's in a state of nearly 6 million people. The total assault rate for the year in question is 1,860, so you're almost 35 times more likely to suffer at the hands of a perpetrator that was born somewhere other than Africa. Black Pigeon Speaks, I'm going to start calling him BPS now, then mentions property prices in Sydney, Vancouver and Auckland. Again, I couldn't see a source, so I found my own in regards to the drivers of property prices. This one reports the often quoted Chinese investment in Sydney is negligible and instead reports US investment and land squeeze as driving the increases in prices. This one reports prices in Vancouver are due to speculation across the board, not just foreign cash. The Guardian does report a slightly different interpretation of the same data. Honestly though, my reading is that the Financial Post has acknowledged the ownership of the high-end homes, which is the Guardian's main point. But the Post also notes that the 4.85% of foreign property ownership is very low. Clearly there's some disagreement. I don't think you can blame this all on foreign people. This article cites low interest rate, investor demand, capital gains expectations, and New Zealanders returning from overseas as the main drivers of Auckland property prices. Specifically, doesn't blame migrants. Now I'd say throughout all this we should keep in mind though that foreign cash is less multiculturalism than globalisation. I don't think this is commenting on multiculturalism at all. BPS mentions grenade attacks in Malmo. Again, I didn't see a source, so I found what I could and ran those sources through Google Translator where necessary. The articles generally blame organised crime for the attacks. I did find one Breitbart article that I'm not going to link to, which makes the claim that this is to be blamed on migrants, but it relied on the fact that data is missing to draw the link, and while claiming that native Swedes are the almost minority, fails to mention that the number 2 and 3 spots on the migrant numbers list is the hugely disparate cultural nations of Denmark and Poland. Much more specific is this Snopes article, which is pretty comprehensive in arguing against the idea that migrants are overly represented in crime stats in Sweden. So I don't feel like any of this stands as a good criticism of migration. Next, there's a statement about suppression of free speech by big tech companies. This is not specific, so it's a bit hard to assess. What I would say is that I am of course aware that some folks are concerned that banning hate speech is tantamount to a curbing of free speech. I would suggest watching the far better videos by Contrapoints on this topic. I would also add that banning hate speech is, I don't think, tantamount to suppressing your ideas. I don't see this BPS video getting a ban, for example. There's a list of references to endless hate crime hoaxes, exhausted social services and facts no longer mattering. I'm honestly not sure what this refers to, nor how it relates to immigration. I'm not convinced that facts no longer matter to society at large, and again, there's no source to assess these claims anyway. The concept of the Great Replacement is then mentioned. I'd again suggest checking out a far better YouTuber, in this case Shaun, and his explanation of why the Great Replacement is not real. So the next section stands as a sort of sub-intro into the academic section. It's mostly rhetorical, and the claims I think all come up in the next section anyway, so I won't dwell on it too much. One thing I will say is that BPS also mentions, just prior to the next section, that some of his ideas come from drawing behavioural conclusions from observations in animals and plants. Given that human behavioural and cognitive complexity is far greater than that of even chimps, I've got to say that's not going to be a sound method in a general sense. Anyway, we're on to the specifics now, so let's not dwell too much on that either. First mentioned in this section is this paper. BPS claims that this sheds light on why we observe that ethnocentric societies have always been stronger. Before assessing the paper itself though, I've got a few thoughts on that apparent observation. It would appear that in our current world it isn't true that ethnocentric societies are always stronger. Take the example of the US. Without knowing how BPS measures strength, the US is multicultural, but still provides over the largest economy in the world. This is an economy that has been growing while immigration has been increasing, and that's a trend for which there exists causation as well. To assess military, the US has arguably the strongest military in the world. Budget spending as a percentage of GDP has decreased somewhat, but the total amount spent has risen over time, again with the increase in immigration. As diversity has increased, it would appear so has the apparent strength of the US. So I wouldn't accept the idea that ethnocentric societies are always the strongest and the best based on that alone. And the thing is, I don't believe that that's what the paper says either. The paper itself concludes using simulation that the strategy of ethnocentrism may be biological in origin. The idea makes some sense when your goal, which is a bad word to use in evolutionary biology, but okay, is to proliferate your genes. Being able to tell who carries your genes and then lend cooperative support to them is helpful to that end. This model certainly supports that conclusion, though I do wonder how relevant this is to the case of humans. As mentioned, human behaviour is understood by academics to be the outcome of a complex combination of genetics and learning that we may never untangle. It's going to be very hard then for any model to accurately capture human behaviour. This is further underlined given that evolutionary biologists now understand that individual genetic differences are greater than the differences between our categories of race. This may be why the paper talks explicitly about plant and animal interactions. Humans are not very good at distinguishing those who are genetically closer to them or otherwise outside of the family group. The model, though, assumes that ethnocentric strategists can perform this function, which is an issue with applying it to humans. To go further, BPS's point about the model implying that ethnocentric nations secede by not reciprocating humanitarian cooperation, while I think applying the model to a scenario that it does not accurately capture, also doesn't, I think, capture the picture of our societies or even their interactions with each other today. Internally, one could again remind themselves that immigration boosts economies, so cooperation in this case is reciprocated. Even if it was not, do we honestly think that failure to successfully participate in a society won't result in punishment? In international terms, concepts like aid also serve to benefit the US as well, which again are not often extended to countries that do not reciprocate. I can't then agree that multiculturalism has resulted in exploitation of a humanitarian society as a given. Regardless though, and I think most importantly, the paper itself talks about evolutionary dominance, not societal. The word society is not mentioned once in the paper, and that I think is because the spread of genetics is not the inarguable goal of a society. The goals of a society are much more subtle in concept with a lot of variance. At least some historical societies have been far more concerned with the spread of ideas in their offspring, for better or worse. A second paper is then mentioned, intended to support the first one. This paper is mentioned in the one we just discussed, and to be honest, my read is that it's even further from a commentary on society than the first example. My read is that it's mostly concerned with when and how cooperation can evolve, given that it so frequently does. So I haven't got much more to say about that one. BPS next mentions a great many resources to build a concept of poor social cohesion in multicultural societies. First, he mentions this paper, correctly identifying its conclusion that increases in immigration lead to a decrease in social trust in this instance. I would mention that the paper also concludes that in cases of low ethnic polarisation, the relationship between social trust and immigration may actually be positive. But let's accept that for now. We'll be coming back to this idea of social trust later because it runs as a common thread through many of the papers cited in the rest of this section. Next is a paper that ostensibly shows that people begrudge new migrants accessing welfare. The clearest thing that I took away from this one was that any effect here was moderated by a context of cultural heterogeneity. Now, I took this to mean that promotion of multiculturalism at a national level leads to acceptance of the access of welfare programs by migrants. Next was this one, presented with the idea that diversity apparently hinders group cooperation. Now, this paper talks about social identity, which is a complex concept. Social identity arises from a number of factors, not just your phenotype or ethnicity. And it's also amenable to change given the right environment. I therefore don't agree that it shows an inevitable and unassailable issue between ethnic groups. Next is this one, which BPS says states that groups more genetically distant from each other, with increasing numbers, will experience reduced trust and increased segregation. So this one is tough to discuss, as it isn't a free to access paper, as many are not, and I would have liked to have seen the figures etc. to be more certain. But going by the abstract, I do think he's got this a little wrong. The mention of a U-shaped relationship between fractionalisation and trust doesn't appear to imply which one drives the other. It could be that in fractioning we incur less social trust, which goes against BPS's main threat. There also doesn't seem to be a mention of population size, which BPS referred to by saying that increased numbers made the situation worse. The commentary on social trust and polarisation is quite clear though. There is a positive relationship supported in this example. Again, as promised, we're coming back to that. Next, this one's showing a conclusion supporting the hunkering down hypothesis, i.e. increases in diversity lead to lower interactions with the community. This concept is again brought up later, so earmark that one for a return as well. One thing I will point out before going on is that this paper did conclude that the effects are not as evident among other minority groups. So again, perhaps not a given that ethnic groups will see conflict on that point alone. Then there's this one. I think BPS's point with this was that diversity increases violence. The paper's stated conclusion was far less focused on a relationship with pluralism and violence though, instead stressing that nation characteristics such as political freedom were far stronger predictors of violence than pluralistic variables. So I don't think this paper supports that position. BPS then mentions a University of Michigan study. I couldn't find it, so I'm just going to move on. Anyone is welcome to link me if they know what that one was about. Then we come to the famous and often cited Putnam paper. Here BPS takes issue with Putnam's delay in publishing, saying that the author didn't like that his results showed that in diverse societies people tend to have lower social trust. BPS also takes issue with some of the author's results, namely the addition of examples where trust issues can be overcome. BPS takes issue by way of dismissing them as, to paraphrase, hopeful and naive. Now it is true that Putnam delayed publishing his results, though he stated he felt it would have been irresponsible to do so until he had developed proposals to deal with the negative aspects of multiculturalism. Given some of the narratives around, this is a concept that I've got to agree with. I also don't think that BPS's characterisation of the caveat on publication is fair. The caveat states, in the long run, however, successful immigrant societies have overcome such fragmentation by creating new, cross-cutting forms of social solidarity and more encompassing identities. Illustrations of becoming comfortable with diversity are drawn from the US military, religious institutions, and earlier waves of American immigration. I would argue strongly that real-world examples of successful integration are not examples of distant maybes. This seems highly relevant to me. So in coming to the end of this section, I think what is left is some support for the concept that social trust is reduced by diversity provided by the papers that BPS has given. Having done some research of my own though, I do not believe that academic consensus, as suggested in a title screen for this section of the video, has been reached on this issue, nor do I believe that this speaks as strongly to social cohesion as BPS appears to infer. For example, here is a paper citing an example that shows no relationship between diversity and generalised trust, and states that all small observed strategic trust relationships were, quote, dwarfed by the effect of economic deprivation and social connectedness. This is supported further by this paper, showing that contact between communities was able to cancel out negative effects of social trust given positive contact. Perhaps most important though is this resource from the Oxford University. It quotes a great many studies in arguing that there is no agreed upon measure of social cohesion, and that the focus on social trust ignores a great many factors like economic inequality and deprivation that may be more important for social cohesion, and also that examples exist that directly contradict others re diversity and a negative relationship between this and social trust. So, to summarise, some evidence exists to suggest that social trust is diminished by diversity in some examples. However, other studies contradict this conclusion, and social trust is thought by at least some experts to be a poor measure of social cohesion. From this, a conclusion that diversity reduces social cohesion cannot be drawn. There are some links to migrant communities and violence, but as stated in sources cited, this has far more to do with factors like political freedom. As a result, I do not think the BPS has established that multiculturalism has failed. No doubt, there have been and will continue to be examples in which groups with competing interests will clash, and so there could arguably be instances in which poor management, exacerbation of apparent differences, and negative interactions can lead to multiculturalism failing in certain circumstances. In such examples, drastic measures may be called for, like Ireland's peace walls, which continue to provide a vital separation between two opposing factions. But even there, the eventual goal is to overcome differences. So because of that, I don't have an issue with the general concept of boundaries being useful sometimes and for a period of time. Nor do I disagree with the need for better protection of marginalised groups in situations like the Balkans example that BPS raises. But such actions need to be held for extreme scenarios. So to paint my picture, I'd like to return to my example of West Melbourne. This is not an overtly violent place to live. While I still overhear some people whinging about the other side occasionally, I also see a lot of blending. We've got mixed race kids and families across a huge diversity of ethnicities, converts to and from a great many religions. We've almost all of us got friends from all over the globe. Separating all of that would be impossible at this point. Absolutely, the current state of our society and its cohesion, which I experience daily, itself does not warrant any attempt or even thought to do so. This on its own can stand testimony to the fact that multiculturalism can succeed in creating good communities. And if that's too anecdotal for you, I'll cite this source. 86% of Australians see multiculturalism as a success. Multiculturalism isn't then some unassailable path to utopia, but nor is it the coming of hordes of replacers with whom white people can never get along. What it is a path to a moral society, based on fairness and equal treatment. One that recognises that diverse perspectives, skills and insights can come together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. If we need to employ a bit of common sense management to achieve that, that's okay. And it seems unlikely that this will involve separation in almost all cases. Instead, it will rely on influence of perceptions and positive interactions to improve understanding and knowledge. Anyway, this has absolutely gone on long enough, and I'll admit I'm really tired. Until next time, this has been Yeah Nah. Thanks for watching.